Chapter 13. Kettering, you're gonna hang. Black against the setting sun, the ramparts of Needle Butte seemed almost close enough to touch when Kettering was still miles away. The serrated, rocky cliffs lifted almost straight up from the plains and tapered more and more as they rose until they ended in the stony, jagged point which gave the butte its name. At its base was the line rider's cabin, and Kettering had swung around so that he approached it from behind, keeping the bulk of the hill between them. Patch was winded and tired from the long, hard run, but he pounded on steadily, unfaltering. They rounded the butte, and in the cover of a rocky outcropping, Kettering pulled the horse in. And as he dropped to the ground, he staggered and caught at the saddle horn to keep himself from falling. For the first time, he realized just how tired he was. Up almost the entire night, under the terrific strain of the attack in the cabin, hammered by McGuire in their last fatal fight, and then, with no more than a few hours' rest, plunged into the exchange of shots and the flight with Harkness, and the constant, mad, breakneck riding at top speed, all without let-up or a breathing spell. He was near the end of his strength. The pace of the events had kept him going, made him to rise to meet each new situation as it appeared, but now he felt his knees trembling with weakness and his head felt heavy and thick. The sprained wrist sent sharp tinges of pain through his arm with each movement. And Patch, he turned his head and nuzzled him, blowing foam over his shirt. He leaned onto the horse and gathered together his last remaining strength. After a moment, he straightened up, slapped the patterned rump gently. "Wait here," he mumbled. The horse watched him with upright ears as he crept cautiously around the base of the red, sun-baked rocks. The first thing that Kettering saw was a horse, hobbled and grazing, and a little farther round he saw a column of smoke rising straight out into the quiet air, and finally then saw the cabin. It was a crude shack, without windows, constructed of small logs and adobe. The only sign of life about it was the grazing animal out on the prairie. But his keen eyes noted that the smoke came from in front of the cabin and not from the chimney. Evidently, Slocum was locked inside, and the man guarding him was sitting outside before an open fire. Cautiously testing each step before he set his foot down, Kettering wormed his way forward. He crossed the open space between the cover of the rocks and the cabin and huddled against the rear wall. With his ear against the rough surface of the sun-dried mud, he listened. There was no sound from inside, but from around in front came a vague humming, as though the guard was singing or talking to himself. Lightly he crept around the side of the house. He moved so as to keep the cabin between himself and the grazing horse, knowing that if the animal lifted its head and saw him, it would surely give warning to the guard, if only by a sudden attention. The murmur was growing louder. Kettering removed his hat and slowly thrust his head around the corner. A cowboy from the ranch, a man by the name of Ballard, sat on the doorstep of the cabin, whittling on a stick and humming idly to himself, and on the ground around him a fire of cattle chips smoldered. Even as Kettering watched, Ballard sighed impatiently and lifted his head to stare out over the prairie in the direction of the ranch. It was a lonely job, and a monotonous one. Kettering had ducked back at the other movements, but in a little while he put his head around again to study the door. It was fastened simply but strongly by a heavy bar resting in sockets on either side of the jamb. That part of the release was going to be easy anyway, and now for the action. He gathered his legs under him, crouched on his toes for one powerful spring. His gun was ready in his right hand. At the slight scuttle of boots, Ballard whirled to be met by the sight of Kettering's body already launching through the air. He threw himself backwards, and his hand darted to his holster, too late. The heavy barrel of Kittering's 6-gun caught him with a single slap above the ear, and he rolled off the step without a sound and then sprawled out on the dry grass. Swift and noiselessly, it was over in a second. Kittering stooped and picked up Ballard's gun and then thrust it into his own belt. And then he rolled the unconscious man around the corner of the cabin and out of sight. As he returned to the door, he cast an anxious look out onto the plains. A tiny cloud of dust was appearing in the east, a cloud which grew bigger even as he was watching. Wilding and his men were coming. But the sun was dropped behind Needle Butte, and shadows were already growing around the cabin. It'd get dark quickly now, and within a few minutes they would be making for it. Hastily, Kittering raised the bar and kicked open the door. "Slocum!" he shouted. The homesteader was sitting on the edge of the cabin's single bunk, and he raised his head as Kittering stalked in, and again the puncher saw, in those strange deep eyes, the slow moving of that mysterious force underneath. Slocum came unhurriedly to his feet, iron muscles rippling under his shirt, and his unshaven face a cold mask. "So you finally got here, did you?" he said. His voice was colorlessly and leaden. "I thought it was about time you showed up." Without warning, his iron fist shot out. It came with the speed and force of a kicking mustang, and it landed squarely on the puncher's chin, and sunlight exploded in Kittering's skull with a shearing, blinding flash. His body hurtled backwards, crashed against the wall, and pitched forward into a crumpled heap on the floor, and he lay still. It was a long time later, it seemed, that he opened his eyes. His head was filled with terrific pain, and his cheek was pressing close against the dirt floor of the cabin. For a moment, his eyes were blank, and then memory flooded back, and he hastily scrambled to his feet, staggering with pain and weakness as he did so. He put a hand on his jaw tenderly, and only his own rugged strength had saved him from a broken jaw, perhaps even a broken neck. Had Slocum really been set for that punch, he would have surely have killed him. His entire skull felt as though a herd of cattle had been driven over top of it. How long had he been unconscious? And what had happened in the meanwhile? Both guns were gone from his belt, the door was open, and through the aperture he saw the approaching horseman, now just barely a mile away. He sprang to the doorway, and as he stepped through, a flying body struck heavily against his knees, and he folded up and went down with Ballard, the guard, sprawled all over him, swinging some wild, powerful punches. Kittering rolled like a cat and came up to his knees, only to be caught by a kick and knocked down again. But as Ballard sprang, Kittering thrust his own leg in between the other's feet and tripped him. Both sprawled and both scrambled up at the same time. From the approaching horsemen came sudden wild shouts and the bark of revolvers. The drum of hoofs changed into a wild gallop, and then Ballard charged, and Kittering held him off with a straight left, his right being almost useless, but there was no shock in his punches, and his battered body was reeling with weakness. Every rush seemed stronger to him, and each shower of punches made him give a little more ground, battering down his guard just a little bit further. The thud and smack of blows came in a steady roll of a drum. A hard fist caught him, a glancing blow on his bruised jaw, and the sudden blinding pain that stabbed through his head made him drop his hands in agony. Ballard rushed, slugging with both hands, and Kittering felt his legs buckle. He went down, rolled over, and began to try to struggle up again, and a booted foot slammed him back down. He caught that foot and pulled, and Ballard went over like a falling tree. But now the thunder of hooves was all about him, and he choked in the cloud of dust. Rough hands yanked him to his feet, a clamor of voices beat about his ears, and he hung limply on their supporting hands. When his head cleared again, a moment later, his arms were being jerked behind him, and he felt the rough scrape of rope against his wrists. Instinctively he tensed his muscles, strained out against the rope, and held himself braced thus until the knots were tied. The confusion and the growing dimness aided in his escaped observation, and although the cowboy tying him drew the rope so tight that they cut into his skin, he managed to hold his position. When he relaxed then, afterwards, he found that he had secured a little play, enough so that, given time, he could maybe just work his hands loose. A little way off, the fire sputtered, its flames making a bright spot of color against the blue dusk. The cowboys were grouped in a rough circle about him, and for the first time he saw Wilding, who was listening to Ballard's story. The foreman's eyes were fixed upon Kittering. "But if Kittering slugged you and let Slocum out, what'd he stay around here for?" he demanded. "There's his horse over there. Why didn't he go with Slocum?" Ballard shrugged. "I don't know. All I know is when I come to, Slocum had pulled his freight, and there was Kittering, so I jumped him. Didn't have no gun neither." "Well," the foreman pushed his hat back, scratched his head. "Anyways, it's a fair trade, I reckon. We know where Slocum's heading for, and we can always get him when we want him. Meantime, I reckon we can take care of this tin-horn bad man. Know what treatment rustlers get in this country, don't you, Kittering?" "Ain't no trees around here, boss," one of the men shouted. "Oh, we ain't so far from Short Hills. There's plenty of trees over there. Come on, boost him up on his horse, and let's get this over with." A cowboy appeared, leading Patch, and Kittering was lifted helplessly to the saddle. One man held his bridle, and the other scattered for their mounts. As the cavalcade moved away from the cabin, the last rays of the setting sun disappeared behind the looming bulk of Needle Butte, and the darkness began to grow swiftly over the plains. Swaying weakly in the saddle, Kittering tasted the grim irony of the situation. They were leading him off to hang him as a rustler, and with his hanging would go Slocum's last chance of keeping Box Elder. Perhaps there was a certain justice in it then, since Slocum's own mistake was responsible. Suspicious, hot-headed, the homesteader had waited for no explanations. He had distrusted Kittering from the beginning, and the puncher's sudden appearance in his prison was proof enough of his complacency with the men of the ranch. He had acted, as his nature impelled him, swift and directly, as he had always acted. The results, however, were evidently going to be more far-reaching than he had ever expected. But Kittering was neither calmly philosophizing nor giving way to panic. He had no desire whatsoever to be hanged, less on Slocum's account than on his own, and he was doing the only thing he could do in his situation. Self-possessed and cool in spite of his physical condition, he was working at the ropes which bound his wrists and trying to conceal it by leaning back against the high cradle of the saddle. The cords gave a little, and he knew that if he could only get enough time, he'd be getting free. A strange, subdued quiet fell over the group of men, and when they spoke at all, it was all in lowered tones. They moved through the darkness to the sound of scuffling hooves, like some grim funeral procession. Kittering never ceased straining at his ropes, and slowly one hand worked towards freeing him, but the ride was all too short for him. Against the dark eastern sky, the vague bulk of the hills loomed already near at hand. A quick tension ran through the group. They drew closer together, forming a compact mass about the prisoner. Wilding halted on the first ridge. He pointed silently to an oak with wide spreading branches, and the men began swift preparations. A rope was produced and flung over a convenient branch, and the noose was dropped over Kittering's head, and then Patch was led under a tree. Wilding urged his horse alongside. There was a small, tight smile on his lips. His eyes were invisible, only as dark shadows. Sorry we had to rush things like this here, Kittering, he said. But when a man gets careless with other folks' property, I reckon he knows what to expect. Kittering, you're gonna hang. Kittering strained in a last desperate effort at the ropes. They were slipping, slowly tearing at his skin as they went. Go on, he said harshly. Make yourself a farewell speech for me. Wilding, you wouldn't be lousier than a dog with fleas, or you wouldn't work so hard at making yourself out being so pure and holy. The foreman's expression didn't change. I don't enjoy hanging a man, he said softly, even if he's made it as much trouble as you have. This here's your last chance, Kittering. If you want me to carry any messages for anybody, I'd be glad to do it for you. Kittering uttered a short laugh. I don't reckon you're exactly reliable, Wilding, even with messages. The foreman shrugged. Well, suit yourself, he replied. It's your funeral. And then smiled with an ugly smile at his own grim humor. He called out, Plug, wheeling his horse away from Kittering. The killer spurred forward. He raised his quirt over his head and with a shout brought it down upon Patch's rump. Kittering felt the horse quiver under him as the leather cut into the hide. Powerful muscles gathered for a convulsive leap, a leap that would snatch the puncher from the saddle and leave him dangling in the air at the end of a rope. In the same fraction of a second, Kittering's knees clamped down hard upon the pony's barrel, and his voice cut through the shouting turmoil of the other men, and Patch checked himself so hurriedly that he nearly fell, as with a terrific jerk Kittering tore his hands free. The frightened pony reared high into the air, driving back the cowboys who had charged forward, and they saw Kittering suddenly free, reach up with bloody hands and throw off the nooses about his neck. Then Patch charged directly through the mob of milling horses. Wilding's mount struck almost head-on, went back and over, throwing the four men headlong from the saddle to roll, bruised and stunned, down the hillside. Guns barked and horses whirled and leapt in mad pursuit as the painted pony disappeared into the darkness. The thunder of hooves rolled in a furious tattoo down the slope. A short way out on the plain, the sheriff of High Springs, riding at the head of a posse, drew in his horse at the sound of the shots. He glanced around at his men. Something going on, he said. Let's go see. They charged forward in the direction of the shooting, so that it was within half a mile that they ran headlong into a tired, staggering pony whose lead was being swiftly cut down by a mob in close pursuit. A half-dozen hands caught the pony's bridle. Kittering! Exclaimed the sheriff. He pushed his horse between the puncher and the lazy Barrack's men. Hold on there, this man is coming with me. I have a warrant for his arrest. Kittering made an attempt to straighten up. A weak smile flitted across his face. Sheriff, he said, it's the first doggone time I've ever been glad to be arrested in my life. Catch him, the sheriff said calmly. He's about to fall. A posseman caught him as he leaned from the saddle. In the velvet blue of dusk, the milling horses and the arm about him all slipped away into blank darkness. End of chapter 13.